Today we're going to talk about factoring trinomials. This is going to be a very important topic for geometry as well as algebra 2. It does take some steps that you have to get used to, but once you get the hang of the steps, it's pretty simple to do. It just kind of takes about 4 steps every time you want to do this. So to talk about it, first I want to review something we looked at in Unit 1. In Unit 1, we learned how to do double distribution, which was when you had a binomial times a binomial. You split the first binomial into 2 parts, and then you wrote the second binomial next to each part, and then you distributed twice. And then your final step was to combine those middle terms to a single term in the middle because those were like terms, and then you ended up with a trinomial. For factoring a trinomial, we're going to start with the trinomial that's at the bottom. We're going to break that middle term into 2 terms that will combine to that middle term. Our goal with those middle terms is that they will combine to equal the middle number and that the coefficients of those numbers will multiply to be equal to this last number. Once we have that broken down, we take the first 2 pieces and we factor out a GCF. We take the second 2 pieces and we factor out a GCF. That's why factoring GCFs was so important yesterday. Then the final step is going to be to take those pieces that are out front, those GCFs, and write them as a single binomial, and then to write the expression that is beside each as your second binomial, and then you'll have a factored trinomial. So it's really just the opposite of double distribution to work these out. So let's look at some examples where we're factoring. Here is a trinomial. When you're factoring, the first step of factoring, in order to make it always feel like you're doing the same process every time, is to think about what your A value is and what your C value is. You want to take A times C, which if it's in standard form, that's the first thing you should do. Put it into standard form, which has the highest power first, then the second highest, and then your constant. The coefficient of your x squared is your A, the coefficient of your x is your B, and the constant is your C. So you want to think about A times C. Well, A here is 1 and C is 6. So the product of A times C here is 1 times 6 is 6. Then you want to think about B. B is a 5. And when you're factoring a trinomial like this, what you need to happen is you need to be taking this middle term, and we are going to be breaking it into a 2-parter here, both of them having an x on them. Our goal is to have them add to a 5x, but these constants, what we want for them is that we want the product of those 2 numbers to be a 6. So we're thinking about what multiplies to 6 and adds to 5. And you can think about it in your mind. We want to multiply to be the 6. So factors of 6 could be like 1 and 6. They could be like 2 and 3. They could be like -1 and -6. And they could be like -2 and -3. You want them to combine to your middle term, and your middle term is 5. So here they combine to 7. Here they combine to 5. These 2 give you -7, and these 2 give you -5. So if we wish to have a sum of 5, then we need the factors to be 2 and 3. So we could break that 5 into a 2x and a 3x. So we can make that middle term, instead of being a 5, we're going to write it in 2 parts, saying it's 2x plus 3x. So then we're going to copy the first part here, which was an x squared, and we're going to copy the 6. So the first step is to break your middle term into 2 pieces, and of those 2 pieces, their sum would be that middle term, and the product of the coefficients is going to be equal to the product of your A times C. Then we're going to take these 2 parts, so this is the first part, and this is the second part, and we're going to factor out our GCFs. The first binomial set, the GCF of them would be just an x. If we factor out an x out of this binomial, the first part we're left with is just an x, because x times x is x squared. And then dividing a 2x by x just leaves a 2. For the second part, factoring out a GCF, the GCF, in this case, it'll always have the sign of this first term, which is a positive sign. I'm going to factor out a positive number. And this has an x, but this doesn't, so we're not going to be taking any letters out. So 3 is going to be the GCF for the numbers 3 and 6. So we're going to take out a positive 3. And if we divide each piece by a positive 3, 3x divided by 3 leaves x, and 6 divided by 3 leaves a 2. You'll know that you did this correctly if this binomial and this binomial match. Then the final step in the factoring is to bring your GCFs together to be a binomial, x plus 3. And then you copy the piece that they were multiplying by next to it, x plus 2. So remember, double distribution, you would split the first binomial, you would write the next one beside it, and then you would multiply, combine like terms. So we know that this would multiply to that trinomial. And these are the factors. So that's how you factor a trinomial. We're going to look at another one, and I'm going to show you a tool that we found online to help you with finding the breakdown of that middle piece. It's called a sum and, what is it called? Let me see, it's over here. It's a product sum calculator, and it's on Wolfram Alpha. So we're going to use the product sum calculator for this question. So remember again, you've got your A, your B, and your C. These are the coefficients on each piece. The coefficient for A is a 1, for B is a -1, and for C here is a -12. Be sure to think about the sign of each one as well. Then A times C is the first thing to do. 1 times -12. That's -12. You want to have a product of -12. And then B is what you wish to have the sum of. B is -1. This is what you want the sum to be. So you could think of factors of -12 that are going to add to a -1, or you can use the Wolfram Alpha sum and product calculator, -12 and -1. We want a product of -12. So in this first part, you're going to put a -12 for the product. We want a sum of -1. So you put in -1 for the sum. Then you click Submit, and it will calculate the factors. So the factors are -4 and 3. Notice that this is the same thing. They just said 3 and then the -4. The order that you write the two factors in on here, you're multiplying -4 times 3 or 3 times -4. Either way, the product is -12 and the sum of the two numbers is a -1. So -4 and 3 are our pieces. So breaking down of this middle term, we want a -4 and a 3. So -4x and a positive 3x. Notice that they add to a -1x. Notice that the coefficients of -4 and 3 will multiply to be this product of -12 that we were looking for. Then we're going to copy the first term and the last term. And so that is the hardest part about this process, is just figuring out what to break down that middle term to be so that you have 4 parts. Next, we're going to factor out the GCF. The GCF of the first two here is just x, which will leave behind x minus 4. Just dividing each piece by x, putting the x out front. The second two pieces, they have a GCF of a positive 3. We're going to take out a positive 3. Dividing 3x by 3 leaves you with x, and dividing -12 by 3 leaves you with -4. Again, remember, if these binomials match, you can feel very good about your work so far. And the next step is to take your GCFs here, write them into their own binomial, and then copy that x minus 4 beside it. And those are the factors. We're going to look at a couple more. So here, again, find your A, your B, your C. A is 1, B is negative 11, C is 10, A times C will be 1 times 10, which is 10. That's what you want the product to be. And then B is what you want the sum to be. You're going to go to the Wolfram Alpha calculator. You want a product of 10 and a sum of negative 11. So product we want is 10. The sum we want is negative 11. Negative 10 and negative 1. So the factors for that middle term we want are negative 10 and negative 1. So we can think about how we want to break this up. This is a 10 over here. So if I write a negative 1x and a negative 10x, then the negative 10 is going to be by this 10, and I kind of like how that is going to look. So we're going to bring down this x squared, bring down this plus 10. If you write the two middle terms, if you write this breakdown, and then you're looking for a GCF, and it's not working out for you to find your GCF, what you might want to do is switch the order that you wrote your two middle terms in. Sometimes that really helps you with finding your greatest common factor. So the first two pieces here, x squared minus 1x, the GCF of those is in x, which will leave me with x minus 1. The GCF of the second two terms here, again, you're going to always take the sign of this one here. It's a negative, and they can both be divided by 10. So we're going to take out a negative 10. Dividing negative 10x by negative 10 leaves you with x, and dividing a positive 10 by a negative 10 leaves you with a negative 1, which is good because we wanted to have those match, and they're both in x minus 1. Next is to write your GCFs as one binomial, x minus 10, and then write the matching binomial set next to that as one binomial. And then we have our factors. The last one has an additional step that we need to do, and this should be the first thing that you think about when you look at a trinomial that you're trying to factor. You want to see if there's a factor that it can, like a GCF, that you can divide out at the very beginning. All of these can be divided by 3. So we can take out a GCF of 3, leaving us with x squared minus 5x minus 6. This way, the next step that I'm going to be doing is just factoring this inside part that I am highlighting. So we're going to look at this part here, and so A is 1, B is negative 5, and C is negative 6. Remember, A times C, so 1 times negative 6 is negative 6. That's what you want the product to be. You want the B value to be the sum, which is a negative 5. So negative 6 is the product, negative 5 is the sum that we would like. Whoops. So negative 6 and negative 5 is what I'm going to enter over here. So the first piece is negative 6, that was the product. The second piece is negative 5, that's the sum. Push submit. Negative 6 and 1. So what we want are the two pieces of negative 6 and 1. So negative 6 and a positive 1. And we're going to look and we're going to be breaking down this middle term, this negative 5x, to have these two pieces. Since I have a negative 6 here, I'm going to write this as a positive 1x and a negative 6x. So we have one at a negative 6 and a 1. And then I'm going to copy the x squared, and I'm going to copy that minus 6. And I'm not going to be using the 3 yet, but I do need to bring that back at the end for part of the answer. Next, I'm going to be factoring out my GCFs. For these two pieces, the GCF is x. Factoring out the x out of x squared leaves x. And positive 1x divided by x is positive 1. For the second part, the GCF is a negative 6. Negative 6x divided by negative 6 leaves x, and negative 6 divided by negative 6 leaves a positive 1. Those binomials match, so we feel good about that. Bring together those GCFs of x minus 6. Copy the other binomial, which is x plus 1. And then bring the 3 down to be part of the answer. 3 should be out front. This way, when you multiply these all back together, you would get the original trinomial. If you didn't write the 3 in the front, you would get back to this trinomial that we have highlighted, and you would not have the actual trinomial you were looking for. So be sure if you do factor out a GCF that you write it out front of your factored form.